All right, so all of the distributions so far that we've talked about have been for continuous variables, continuous random variables. So probability density functions. The binomial distribution is for discrete random variables, so probability mass functions. We've already been using it, actually, to simulate coin flips. It's used for binary 0 or 1 outcomes. So like heads versus tails. So the parameters of the binomial distribution are the number of trials, so the number of coin flips, and the probability of the outcome of 1. So with a fair coin, as we've been doing so far in these live lessons, the probability of an outcome of 1 of heads is 0.5. And the third parameter is size, so the number of experiments with n trials per experiment. So we've done this before, where we have 5 coin flips per experiment and 1,000 experiments. So that's something we've been talking about for a long time in these live lessons. And we used it to create this plot. So assuming a fair coin, 0.5, we used the NumPy binomial method from the random module, and we've been doing this exact code. So these 6 lines of code here, we've already run earlier in the notebook, but back then I said, just kind of trust me about this binomial method, and now I'm explaining what it really is. So we pass in those 3 arguments, the number of trials per experiment, the probability of, say, heads, and a fair coin is 0.5, and the number of experiments with however many trials there are per experiment. So we should get the exact same plots as we had earlier. And we've always been working with a fair coin, but you can model processes binomial, meaning that it's binary, that there's a 0 or a 1 outcome, a positive or a negative outcome, but we could equally model a binary process that is not equally likely heads or tails, say. So let's say we had a weighted coin that gave heads 80% of the time. So the only argument that I'm changing in the code is this is 0.8 now instead of 0.5. And let's see what our distribution looks like. So now out of 1,000 experiments, we had none with 0 head flips, whereas we had quite a few with 5 head flips. So there were, in 30% of them, we tossed 5 heads. And the mode is 4. So we most often got 4 heads flips out of 5 tosses. That's a stark contrast to what we have with a fair coin, right? So 2 different PMFs, both created with the binomial distribution. So technically speaking, binomial distributions are created by sampling greater than 1 Bernoulli trials. So the Bernoulli distribution is equivalent to the binomial distribution where n is equal to 1. So, a coin flip experiment where we just flip 1 coin. So you could run this line of code here as many times as you'd like, and each time you run it, you'll get a different coin flip. So, this time I got tails, and this time I got heads, and I run it again, I get heads again. So that's a Bernoulli trial. Each one of these is a Bernoulli trial, and technically speaking, these binomial distributions are created by running this Bernoulli trial many times. So some real-world examples where you might use a Bernoulli distribution to model it include things like making it to work on time. So that's a binary outcome. Did you make it on time or not? A candidate being invited to interview. Either they were invited to interview or they weren't. And in epidemiology, we can use it to model the probability of, say, death or catching the disease or not catching it. Okay, and then the multinomial distribution is a generalization of the binomial distribution that we just talked about. So it's a generalization of it to discrete random variables with more than 2 possible outcomes, right? So the binomial distribution, we can only have 2 outcomes, 0 or 1. With the multinomial distribution, we could have more than 2. So, for example, the roll of a die has 6 possible outcomes. So let's do 1,000 experiments with a multinomial distribution and up to 6 possible outcomes. So this is modeling rolling a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6. And so by default, the probability of any one of these events is equally likely. And so when we plot that out, the probability of rolling a 1 or a 3 or a 6 or whatever, it should be about the same. So by default, each of the bars in our multinuclear distribution are uniformly distributed. So earlier I talked about uniform distributions being appropriate for modeling things like rolling a die or drawing cards, when in fact, the uniform distribution is intended really for continuous random variables, for probability density functions. Whereas the multinuclear distribution that we're looking at now is really intended for probability mass functions, for discrete random variables. And just to get into this technical nitty-gritty, which you might as well know, is that just as in the binomial case, multinomial distributions are technically created by sampling greater than 1 multinuclear distributions, where the multinuclear distribution is equivalent to the multinomial distribution when n is equal to 1. So here's an example. It's like a single dice roll. So in this case, I roll a 3. In this next case, I roll a 2. I roll the die again, I get a 2 again. So this multinuclear distribution is equivalent to the Bernoulli distribution that we talked about here, which was like flipping a single coin. So these multinomial distributions are created by sampling a bunch of these single multinuclear distributions. Since multinomial distributions can represent any categorical variable, for example, a burger, a hot dog, or pizza, or the 52 playing cards in a deck, or all of the teams in the NFL, the National Football League, not just integer values, we can't always calculate an expected value like we can when we use a multinuclear distribution or a multinomial distribution to model dice rolls.